to very briefly describe the different kind of aspects of an early warning system that the REL Northwest put out and that we're using in all of these early warning system series. But another way of conceptualizing early warning systems is up on this slide. And what I like about this conceptualization is it shows the interconnection a little bit. It's a different visualization of how early warning systems work actually plays out in school and district settings and state settings. And so today what's circled in the red, the validating indicators, this customizing and developing tools and supports, and then this launching and implementing early warning systems, that's what we're going to be talking about today. But we know that these are connected. So however you go about validating your indicators, those are what you're going to anchor all of your supports around. And then we also know that there has to be that kind of explicit decision and intentional decision made to go ahead and launch and implement our work. So these three areas that are circled, that's what we're going to be focusing in on today. And before we get any further into it, we do want to take just a few moments and talk about, well, okay, what are early warning indicators? So early warning indicators are based on your student level data, and I know that Logan's going to be talking more about these later on, but we also want to make sure that they're often talked about as when students get flagged or students are flagged for certain aspects. So these indicators are often can be called flags, but really what's important is that they tell us that there's a symptom, a student is flagged, but they don't tell you why or the cause of what's going on. So what these really help us do is really help us figure out how we can allocate our resources and supports to really support the students who need them, so the students that are getting flagged, and really target those resources, because we know that we don't have an infinite amount of resources and capacity in schools. So these indicators can help us really target our supports to students. Also allows us this last aspect on the slide of looking at groups of students. People really think about early warning students and easily understand the concept of looking student by student, but we also know it's really important to look at groups of students as well. And that's where these indicators can help us out. So common indicators that we hear a lot about and we know people are using, and these are often great places to start, are attendance, behavior, and course performance, and often kind of shortened down to being called the ABCs, since in education we like to shorten everything a lot. And the attendance, behavior, and course performance, these indicators are common for high school graduation, and they're also common for being used in middle grades or middle school for predicting high school graduation. But there's different cut points depending on what grade level you're focusing on. And I have another slide in just a few slides that gets to more explicit information about the variation of those cut points. But so how do we determine what indicators are and where the cut points are? Well, the information that's on the slide right now is data that was taken from the 2002 cohort in Chicago Public Schools. And what the researchers did is they said, okay, let's look at the days absent per semester for students, and they grouped them in those ranges of 0 to 4 days, 5 to 9 days, and et cetera, where those different columns are. And they matched that to the percentage of who graduated in 4 years. They were looking at an outcome of on-time graduation in 4 years. And they were able to say, okay, this is our distribution and our spread of what percentage of students graduate based off of how many days absent per semester they are. So they said, okay, this is what our data are showing us. And then they'll be able to say, all right, well, where do we want to make our cut point based off of our data? So this is high school attendance data. And my next slide is very similar, but for freshman course failures. And being comfortable in looking at your data in this way and kind of as it's spread out this way will help you determine what indicators are right for you, as well as what cut points are appropriate for you and your local context. And so this work in Chicago is really one of the foundational pieces. There was also work done in Baltimore as well that really helped us say, okay, if we're starting out, what should we be using for our common high school graduation indicators and thresholds? So this slide summarizes that. And I'm not going to go over all of it. It's here for you. I know you can download the slides later on. But the notion really gets at, while we can use the same indicators, the thresholds or those cut points change depending on if you're in middle school or high school. And then this notion of behavior, you'll see that behavior, we don't have any kind of agreed upon cut points or thresholds, because behavior changes so differently from school to school, classroom to classroom. We're hoping less on the classroom to classroom and school to school, but we know between districts a certain behavior does not have the same consequence. And so it's really hard to say, well, district-wide or nationally, here's what we know about behavior incidents. We know that behavior is really important. We know it needs to be an indicator and that there needs to be a cut point or a threshold about when a student is identified as being at risk. But when that happens is going to be based off of the local context. We also know that in general, over 100 early warning indicators have been researched. So I gave you the basics and really common ones that are used, but there's also been a tremendous amount of research around these are just a sample of other indicators that have been used, and they have different results in terms of the predictability about whether or not they're a good predictor for high school graduation. Some of these are kind of individual aspects, and some of these are composite. That last one of an on-track indicator, it combines a couple of different data points to determine if a student is at risk or not. So all this is said is that there's a lot of different ways that you can look at and what types of indicators you can use, and it's really important to take your local context into account as you're thinking about what indicators you want to have in your early warning system. So in order to make sure that your indicators are appropriate for you, they need to be valid for your intended purpose. So you want to make sure that they match what it is that you're measuring for. It's also really important that they be actionable. So if we have an indicator that we at the school or district or state can't really do anything about, it's maybe interesting to note, but really hard for us to take action, because the whole notion of these early warning systems is to identify students that are at risk and then get them back on track really quickly through interventions and supports. We also want them to be meaningful and easily understood. So if it's really complex in either getting the data or understanding your data, that can make it be really hard to then take action. And also you want to make sure that these are aligned with your district and school priorities. And there will be some upcoming REL West publications that help walk people and districts through this notion of what would be indicators at your local level that take your local context into account, and then helping you determine when to make that cut point. I know that was a really fast overview of indicators, but we wanted to pause here. Kenwin's going to join me. We're going to see if there's any questions so far just on this notion of indicators and early warning indicators.
Yes, there's a couple questions. One that just came in from Susan, and I partially answered her in the chat. She said, are there national results to use for comparisons, or are most studies specific to a particular place? So I wrote a little bit in there, but I'd love for you to address that question.
Yeah, there's actually a couple of studies out there that have actually kind of compiled other research studies and have been clear about what indicator they were looking at and what the predictability, sensitivity, and they kind of give a lot of the statistical information. And I don't remember off the top of my head if it says where the location of the research was done, but I believe it does. And we can share that information. While our other presenters are presenting, I can find a link for that piece and we can put it in the chat box.
Okay, we can also send that out tomorrow with all of the other resources we're sending.
And then I also see Daniel's question, and so the aspect about crosstabs alone or doing regression models, and so this is something that it really depends on kind of the local capacity. And so this guide that we're working on that's through REL West that will be coming out later this year actually answers Daniel's question in terms of there's trade-offs of how you go about doing your validation process, and so it really depends on your local capacity. While we know that in some cases regression models can really provide the sensitivity and the specificity that we need, oftentimes we don't have the ability to do that, particularly in low capacity districts. And so there are a couple of publications that are coming out that give guidance as to how local districts can go about selecting those indicators and cut points.
Great, thank you. And I just want to acknowledge some of the questions that came in ahead of time really aren't being addressed in this webinar, but there are other webinars in this series that will address those, such as targeted intervention models for particular issues like attendance or groups of students. And so for anyone that's really looking at that intervention piece, I would look to the earlywarningsystems.org from AIR and then the Learning Series webpage here. And then before we move on and hand this over to our practitioners from the Davis School District, there's some general questions about the systems overall and how these can provide benefits to a Title I school or district. Jenny, because we got about 3 of those questions, I thought you just might want to take a moment to say something to that.
Yeah, and actually there was a webinar as part of the series last week that had a state's perspective, and Massachusetts actually has, as part of their priority schools focus, they have a, I believe, requirement that schools, not Title I specifically, but if they're priority schools, that they have to do an early warning system work. And I think this notion of can and how can Title I schools really use and integrate early warning systems is going to become a really important aspect as Every Student Succeeds Act move forward, because I think that's going to be something that's in there. I think part of where we haven't seen a lot of Title I usage is historically there haven't been as many high schools that have self-identified as Title I schools. And that's slowly shifted over time, but I think that's one aspect of it. But I do believe middle grade schools have started to access Title I funds, particularly around the intervention support aspect for it. So I think that that's something that we're going to see a lot more of in the future.
Okay, great, thank you. I think it's time then to move on to our practitioners here in Utah.